I was sick unto death with that long agony, and when they at length unbound me, and I was permitted to sit up, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. I felt that I lay upon my back unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water, and ate and drank with avidity. Shortly afterward, I attempted to make a tour around my prison. I had little object, certainly no hope in these researches, but a vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure, and I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor was treacherous with slime, and even so, I slipped and fell violently on my face. A few seconds afterward, I comprehended my position. My forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sullen plunge into water. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the wells, of which my imagination now pictured many in various positions around the dungeon. In other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once by plunging into one of these abysses, but now I was the veriest of cowards. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length a deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course, I know not, but when once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild sulphurous luster, the origin of which I could not at first determine, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of the prison. My personal condition had been greatly changed during the slumber. I now lay upon my back, and at full length, on a species of low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap resembling a surcingle, which left at liberty only my head and my left arm to such an extent that I could, by dint of much exertion, supply myself with the meat from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. Something on the ceiling of the dungeon captured my attention. It was a huge pendulum, which was swinging slowly. What mainly disturbed me was that with each swing it descended perceptibly. Also, its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glittering steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn, the horns upward, and the under edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole hissed as it swung through the air. Oh, what boots it to tell of the long, long hours of horror, more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of steel, inch by inch, line by line, down, and still down it came. Days passed, ere it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed, I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar. And then I fell suddenly calm and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. The vibrations of the pendulum was at right angle to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of my heart. It would fray the serge of my robe. It would return to repeat its operation again and again. Notwithstanding its terrifically wide sweep and the hissing vigor of its descent, sufficient to sunder these very walls of iron, still the fraying of my robe would be all that for several minutes it would accomplish. Down, steadily down it crept. To the right, to the left, far and wide, with a shriek of a demon spirit. I shrank convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward and upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. They closed themselves spasmodically at the descent, although death would have been a relief. Oh, how unspeakable. Still, I quivered in every nerve to think how slight a sinking of the machinery would precipitate that keen, glistening axe upon my bosom. Suddenly, There flashed upon my mind an idea, and I proceeded at once with the nervous energy of despair to attempt its execution. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited for motionlessness on my part to make me their prey. With particles of the oily and spicy meat, I thoroughly rubbed the strap wherever I could reach it, and then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. I had not counted in vain upon the animal's voracity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt the surcingle. This seemed a signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon, swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I was stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my bosom and chilled with a heavy clamminess my heart. Yet 1 minute, and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly, I perceived the loosening of the strap. At length, I was free. But the stroke of the pendulum already had divided the serge of my robe, and a sense of sharp pain shot through every nerve. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the straps and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For a moment at least, I was free. Free, and in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison when the motion was drawn up through the ceiling. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. Free. I had but escaped in one form of agony, to be delivered into worse than death in some other. Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. The heat rapidly increased, and once again I looked up, shuddering as if in a fit of ague. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the change was obvious in form. The roof had been square. The walls of the cell were closing in, moving closer to me. But I neither wished nor desired them to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. At length, for my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered on the brink of a deep pit. What? Yes, there was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fading into the abyss. It was that of General LaSalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his destruction. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He had been drinking much. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never be done wringing his hand. I said to him, "Oh, by the way, my dear Fortunato, I'm glad we've met. I have received a bottle of what passes for Amontillado wine, and I have my doubts." "A pipe of Amontillado? Oh, Montresa, that's impossible. In the middle of the carnival. Amontillado, indeed." "Yes, I was going to ask you to test it for me. But you're busy, so I'm on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he." "Lucchese can't tell Amontillado from sherry." "And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own." No. Come, let's go to your vaults. I'll tell you whether you have Amontillado or not. Lucchese can't distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato took my arm, and we hurried to the archway that led into the vaults beneath my palace. We passed down a long and winding staircase, coming at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. "Well, Montresa, where's this Amontillado you think you have?" "Oh, it's farther on. But observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." "It's nitre. Nitre, isn't it?" "Yes. How long have you had that cough? Oh, no, it is nothing. Come, we'll go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We'll go back. You'll be ill, and I can't be responsible. Besides, there's Luke Casey. Enough. The cough is a mere nothing. It won't kill me. True. And indeed, I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily. But you should use all proper caution here. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damp. Here, I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. He raised it to his lips with a leer, and he said, I drink to the buried that repose around us. And I drink to your life. The wine sparkled in his eyes as we proceeded. We passed through long halls of piled skeletons with casks and puncheons intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I seized Fortunato by the arm above the elbow. The nitre, my dear Fortunato, you see, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we'll go back ere it's too late. Your cough... No, it's nothing. Let's go on. But first, please, another draught of the Medoc, if you don't mind. I broke and handed him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it in a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upward. At the most remote end of the crypt, there appeared another, less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depth of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. I said to him, Proceed, Fortunato. The Amontillado is in here. My friend stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. In a moment more, and I had chained him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples. Throwing the links of the chain around his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to lock it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess, and then I said, My dear Fortunato, pass your hand over the wall. You can't help feeling the nitre, can you? Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you. But, Montresa, the Amontillado. True, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I had just spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar, which I had placed there earlier. With these materials and with the aid of my trowel, I began to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low, moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might listen to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. And then at last the clanking subsided. I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the torch over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from out the niche a slow laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest.
We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Yes, over the wine.
Yes, over the Amontillado.
A very good joke indeed. An excellent jest. But will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone.
Yes, let's be gone.
For the love of God, Matracer!
Yes, for the love of God. But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud,
Fortunato!
No answer.
Fortunato!
No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jangling of the chains. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. I hastened to make an end of the labor. I forced the last stone into its position. I plastered it up. And against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bone. For the past half a century, no mortal has disturbed them. Pace requiescat. During the whole of a dull, dark, and resoundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul. I finally forced myself to ride on to the house. The closer I got, the more abominable became this feeling of unutterable depression. A man took my horse, and I entered to be greeted by my old schoolmate, Roderick Usher. I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely a man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. Finally, he spoke of the object of my visit, for I had traveled far at his very earnest request to be with him in his gloomy hereditary castle. He mentioned his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and a family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. It was a fear, an uncontrollable fear, an oppressive gloom which pervaded his soul. It was, I concluded, a form of hereditary melancholia which was slowly driving him out of his senses. Moreover, to accentuate the symptoms, was his avowed manner of living. He never at any time left the house for some indefinable fear of the tarn or marsh which surrounded the castle. Moreover, he was grieved with the long-continued illness and closely approaching death of a tenderly beloved sister, the Lady Madeline, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative. Her death would leave him the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. For several days I was busy in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened as if in a dream to the wild improvisations of his squeaking guitar. I shall always remember the many solemn hours I spent trying to persuade him to return to a civilized world with me. But his fear, his ungrounded yet omnipresent fear, held him tenaciously to the place of his birth. One morning, with an unnatural firmness, Roderick abruptly informed me that the Lady Madeline was no more, that the strange disease had claimed her at last. Before I could state my profound sorrow at this ghastly news, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight before the final burial in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. So at his request, I personally aided in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it was small, damp. It was more of a dungeon than a vault, a dungeon which had most likely seen many horrors in the past centuries. We opened the door, a massive iron gate which was so immensely heavy that it caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved on its hinges. Once inside, we placed our mournful burden upon trestles. and partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin, looking upon the young face of the Lady Madeline. The disease had left the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. We replaced the lid and closed the door of iron. We made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. For the next week, Usher was strange. I saw him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sounds. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet uncertain degrees the wild influences of his fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was more than a week after we had placed the Lady Madeline within the vault that he burst into my room late one night. He stared about the room in silence for a moment, and then he abruptly turned to me and he said, "You have not seen it? You have not seen it? Oh, but you shall, you shall!" And so speaking, he hurried to one of the windows and threw it open to the storm. The fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. A whirlwind had apparently centered around the castle, blowing wildly, raising a tremendous noise. The clouds were exceedingly dense and low, so low that they touched the turrets of the house. Yet in all of this there was a light. Under the surfaces of the huge masses of vapor which swept around madly was an unnatural light of a faintly luminous phosphorescence which paled everything in a ghastly, unnatural yellow. It rose from the stagnant swamp which surrounded the castle. I closed the window, and then I told Usher I would read to him from one of his favorite volumes. This I did. But as I read, Roderick sat in a chair beside me. He rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. And as I read, I thought I heard strange scraping noises coming from the inner parts of the house. Becoming more unnerved, I leaped to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. But as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, there came a strong shudder over his whole body. A sickly smile quivered about his lips, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I understood the hideous import of his words. "Hear it. Hear the noise from the vault below. Yes, I hear it, and have heard it long, many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it, yet I dared not speak. I tell you, old friend, we have put her in a living tomb." "Roderick, what are you saying?" "Yes, I heard them many days ago, yet I dare not speak. Have you not heard the rending of her coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the archway of the vault?" "Roderick, do you mean the Lady Madeline?" "Yes. Where shall I go? She will be here soon. She'll scold me for my haste in burying her. She'll be here. Have I not heard her footsteps in the stair? Do I not hear that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? No! No, she's just outside the door! Just outside the door!" As if in the superhuman energy of his utterance, there had been found the potency of magic. The huge antique panels of the door swung slowly back. There was the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold, and then with deliberate, slow steps, she walked toward her brother, who stood petrified with fear. Finally, with a low, moaning cry, she fell heavily upon Roderick, and in her final death agonies, bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber of the dead and from the mansion I ran with all my strength. The storm was blinding in its fury. I ran out over the old causeway, crossing the swamp, and as I did, I suddenly heard a tremendous shock. I turned to see what caused it. God in heaven! The great building actually divided in two. Something blinding burst in the center of the castle, and it came tumbling down. The mighty walls burst into a million pieces. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters. And the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher. true. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I'm mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out. And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feeling of triumph, to think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped on the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quiet, and still, and said nothing. For a whole hour I didn't hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. When I had waited for a long time very patiently without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot from out of the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or body, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And now, have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but an over-acuteness of the senses? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. It grew quicker, and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I've told you that I am nervous, and so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. And I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there for many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no longer. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. And when I made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the clock sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light, for what had I now to fear? 3 men entered, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputized to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I had them search, and search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest themselves, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied I heard a noise. No doubt I now grew very pale. But I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased. What could I do? I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles. I paced the floor to and fro with heavy stride, as if excited to fury by the observation of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I fumed. I raved. I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no! No, they heard! They suspected! They knew! They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder! 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 Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart!
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest band which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons. There were ballet dancers. There were musicians. There was beauty. There was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of the seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite, and so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chambers. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the 6th with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there a light of any kind emanating from a lamp or candle within the rooms. But behind each huge window there stood a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the rooms. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western, or black room, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within it at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the hour was to be struck, there came from the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to listen to the sound. And thus the waltzers ceased their evolutions, and while the chimes of the clock rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale. But in spite of this, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. It was he who had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7 there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell. Before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many in the crowd who became aware of a masked figure not seen before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of surprise, then finally of terror or horror, and of disgust. The whole company seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the face was made so nearly to resemble that of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the difference. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was sprinkled with the scarlet horror. Prince Prospero was standing in the eastern or blue chamber when he saw the figure. In a voice that rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, he said,
"Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements.
At first, there was a slight rushing movement among the courtiers in the direction of the intruder, but no one stopped him. With deliberate and stately step, he walked toward the prince and passed within a yard of him, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even then to the violet. It was then that the Prince Prospero, maddened with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger and approached rapidly to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, who by now had reached the end of the black room. Suddenly he turned and confronted the prince. There was a sharp cry. The dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, and instantly afterward Prince Prospero fell prostrate in death. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers threw themselves into the black room, seizing the mummer whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock. They tore away the mask and the robe. They gasped in horror. There was nothing inside. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in their blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay. And the flames of the tripods expired. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. My attention for the last 3 years had been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago it occurred to me quite suddenly that in the series of experiments made hitherto, there had been a very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had as yet been mesmerized in articulo mortis, at the point of death. It remained to be seen first whether in such a condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the mesmeric influence. Secondly, whether this influence was affected by the act of dying. Thirdly, to what extent, or for how long a period, the approach of death might be arrested by the process. In looking around me for some subject on whom to experiment, I was brought to think of my friend, Monsieur Ernest Valdemar, who has resided principally at Harlem, New York, since the year 1839. On 2 or 3 occasions, I had put him to sleep with little difficulty. His physician had declared him a confirmed tubercular. It was his custom, indeed, to speak calmly of his approaching death as a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. I spoke to him frankly, describing my curiosity as to what effect mesmerism would have upon a man at the point of death, and his interest seemed vividly excited. He agreed to the experiment, and it was arranged that he would send for me about 24 hours before the time his physicians expected him to die. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Monsieur Valdemar himself the following note. You may as well come now. My doctors have agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Signed, Valdemar. I went to him immediately. We spoke freely on the subject of his approaching death, as well as more particularly of the experiment proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. I was induced to proceed by my conviction that I had not a moment to lose, as he was evidently sinking fast. I commenced the passes which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of mesmeric influence. With a few rapid lateral passes, I made the eyelids quiver, and with a few more, I closed them altogether. At 3 o'clock in the morning, his pulse was imperceptible, the breathing almost stopped. His limbs were rigid and cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. I ventured a few words of conversation. Monsieur Valdemar, I said, are you asleep? He made no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question again and again. At its 3rd repetition, his whole body was agitated by a very slight shivering. The eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display a white line of the ball. The lips moved sluggishly, and from between them, in a barely audible whisper, issued the words,
"Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die."
"Well, do you still feel pain in the chest, Monsieur Valdemar?"
"No pain. I am dying."
Well, I didn't think it advisable to disturb him further just then, and nothing more was said or done until the arrival of Dr. Farnham, who came a little before sunrise and expressed unbounded astonishment at finding the patient still alive. After feeling the pulse and applying a mirror to the lips, he requested me to speak to Valdemar again, and I did so, saying, "Monsieur Valdemar, do you still sleep?" As before, some minutes elapsed before a reply was made, and during the interval the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said very faintly, almost inaudibly,
"Yes, still asleep. Dying."
Just then, Monsieur Valdemar apparently died. His eyes rolled slowly open, the pupils disappearing upwardly. The skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much parchment as white paper. The upper lip at the same time writhed itself away from the teeth, which it had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception was the appearance of Monsieur Valdemar at this moment that there was a general shrinking back from the region of the bed. There was no longer the faintest sign of vitality in Monsieur Valdemar, and concluding him to be dead, we were consigning him to the charge of the nurses when a strong vibration was observed in his tongue. Then there issued from the distended and motionless jaws a voice such as it would be madness to attempt describing. It seemed to reach our ears from a vast distance or from some deep cavern within the earth. Monsieur Valdemar spoke, obviously in reply to the question I had put to him a few minutes before, when I asked if he still slept. He now said,
"No, I have been sleeping, and now I am dead."
No person present even affected to deny or attempted to repress the unutterable shuddering horror which these few words thus uttered were so well calculated to convey. Slowly, very slowly, we regained our senses. We examined the body again for signs of life. There was no breath, and the attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. The only indication, indeed, of the mesmeric influence was now found in the vibration of the tongue whenever I asked Monsieur Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but could not. The next day, we discussed the propriety and feasibility of awakening him, but we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose could be served by so doing. It was evident that, so far, death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric process. It seemed clear to us that to awaken Monsieur Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant or at least his speedy dissolution. From this period until the close of last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls at Monsieur Valdemar's house. During these 7 months, Valdemar remained exactly as I have last described him. It was on last Friday that we finally resolved to make the experiment of awakening or attempting to awaken him. I made the customary passes. These for a time were unsuccessful. The first indication of revival was afforded by a partial descent of the eyes. It was observed as especially remarkable that this was accompanied by an outflowing of a yellowish ichor from beneath the lids of a pungent and highly offensive odor. And then I asked, Monsieur Valdemar, can you explain to us what are your feelings or wishes now? The tongue quivered, or rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained rigid as before, and at length the same hideous voice which I have already described spoke.
For God's sake, quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. Then I set about awakening him. In this attempt, I soon saw that I should be successful, and I'm sure that all in the room were prepared to see the patient awaken. For what really occurred, however, it is quite impossible that any human being should have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passes, his whole body at once, within the space of a single minute or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands. Upon the bed before the whole company, there lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence.